So hi, everybody. Whilst we're letting people in, and I'm going to try and not mangle what Tom and Joan wanted to say, please do put in the chat where you're calling from, how you're feeling, and if you were on our last conversation, how you left that conversation feeling, because we'd really love to know more about the room and how the room is overall feeling. Tom and Joan, did I say that right?
Yes. I guess maybe if there's some question that particularly brought you back that you would like to see pursued in greater depth, then put that there. In short, there are no limits. If it's an important, relevant issue, then put it in because that'll help us move on a path that's of most value to you.
How are you, Louie? Nice to see you. Hello, Stan. Nice to see you.
Hello, Tams, and hello all. Great to be here.
I know it's an early morning.
Hey, Stan.
No, great to see you, Tom, Jerry, Tams, many others.
And I'll manage the waiting room, the entry, and maybe we want to start. So I'll give a very quick thank you, everybody, for coming back. If you were here last time, thrilled that Ela has Wi-Fi connectivity this time, so it's also here. And I'm going to hand over to Joan to kick us off.
Well, I'd like to begin just by welcoming you, and particularly welcoming those who returned from this conversation, which actually began, I believe, on October 10th, which feels like a different world forever ago, and also to welcome those of you who are joining this conversation for the first time. For those who are just entering now and didn't hear the earlier comment, please introduce yourself in the chat and a little bit about what you're feeling, why you're here, why you came back, just whatever's important to give us something. And the us is not the speakers, but the entire group, something to work with, to play with, to explore more deeply as we move ahead today. You know, at the heart of this conversation is an exploration of strategies for improving social change. We recognized, and that really sort of means Tamsin and her group recognized that much of our current civil society, activist, advocate system was designed for a very different world. A world without intense social media, a world where dishonesty, fake news, outright lies was frowned upon. It's not that it didn't happen, but it was frowned upon, and it was an issue of great shame and problem if caught. No longer true. A world where instead of 85% of the world having experienced, the effects of human-induced climate change, only a small percent of the people had had those experiences. So it was a very different world, and we need something different. It seemed that our old systems were inadequate for bringing social change, but perhaps more significantly, they were out of sync and a mismatch with today's young people who own the future, whose future it is. So the job ahead of us today is, how do we nurture new systems and new spaces for social change? We began our conversation last month with an assumption that there was something about multi-generational collaboration. Certainly true, and that's still an issue. But we also found ourselves facing an unexpected opportunity and barrier to change: the mental health crisis facing today's young people. Loneliness, depression, isolation. My niece, who recently held a senior position in a congressman's office in Washington, D.C., told me there were two overriding issues. One issue was that of climate change, and this is for the U.S., climate change and gun violence. And the other, which did, I have to say, surprise me, that even the deeply caring older generation lacked the urgency that the situation warranted. Even the people who said, we're here, we're doing this, we're that, we lack the sense of urgency. So on today's journey, we have our 4 guides from October. Gregory, ecosystem weaver and gardener from India. Joe Elborn of the Evans Foundation. Indra Adnan, the author of Politics of Waking Up. And all these people have much more, but we don't want to spend our time on that. And Shaun McInerney, educator and co-founder of the Togetherness Practice. Throughout the session, put your comments, questions, observations into the chat to fuel a conversation. For after the comments, remember, our goal is to create a dialogue and of everyone who is here today. So your thoughts, your feelings, where we need to go. So in advance, I'd like to thank you all. And now I will turn it to Ela.
Hi, good evening. It's really, really lovely to see your faces and your names and yeah, feel your energies through the screen and through the chat. I was very much there at the beginning of our last call and then very much not and spent about an hour and a half trying to get my internet to work. But I'm just in a part of the world where the internet doesn't want to work, she doesn't work. And that day she was not working. So I'm slightly curious to be starting this because I think maybe the gift that I can bring is to drop something in. And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to drop in my perspective and my thoughts based on my life experience and my work. And I don't know actually how that's going to sit with what was talked about last time. But I want to start with this phrase, mental health crisis, because I think it's a good place to start. I think our language is often a good place to start. And there's something about this phrase as a young person. I'm 22. And so whatever our definition is of young person, usually I fit that unless we're talking about children. There's something about that phrase that doesn't sit quite right with me, doesn't sit right with what I see, what I experience. And I work within a community of young people who span pretty much the entire globe, maybe not Australia. I think Oceania is the only continent that we haven't fully tapped into. But aside from that, young people across Africa, across Asia, across Europe, and across the States and Southern America as well. And I won't sit and say that there aren't issues and that there aren't strong complexities in the way that young people think of themselves and their relationship to the world. And yet I hesitate to say that there is a crisis within their mental health, because I often think that actually a lot of it is a completely understandable response to the way that the world is right now. And I say this as someone who has been hospitalized, who has been diagnosed, who has been on medication, and who has had the experience with, I grew up in the United Kingdom, so with the United Kingdom's free mental health system and the experience of being, you know, I guess a being within that mental health crisis, right? A part of that statistic. And that, for my own experience and for the experience of a lot of young people who I know and not only know, but love and care for, the change really happened when actually we stopped seeing ourselves as an individual being who was sick or who was ill or who needed some kind of fixing or some kind of treatment. Because we needed to, I think there is a sort of idea of you have depression, or you have anxiety, or you have OCD, or you have bipolar, or, you know, this endless list of diagnoses. And so you don't function in this society well. And so you need to change so that you can function well in this society. And actually, the older I get, the less I want to function well in this society. In reality, the less I think that the way that things are perceived or working is something that I want to fit neatly into. I want to fit into it, of course. I am just a human. I want to belong. We all do, I think. And yet, I'm happy to fit in a little bit uncomfortably. I think it feels important to have that discomfort, to have those cracks, to not attempt to just walk the path that, you know, I was taught from before I was born that I should follow. And yeah, I think that was the thing that I wanted to drop in, and that was what I would have brought last time had my internet decided to kick me out. But also that I think there was, I'm choosing to believe that there was an importance in that, right? The internet is as much a being in this conversation as I am, with as much agency and will, I think, as I have. And then I'm curious because also within our community, the point in our cycle that we're at is we have a big gathering of young people and adult allies every January. And in previous years, we've kind of really explored, you know, what does it mean for young people to design the future of education? What do we need to learn? How do we need to be? What do we need to do to create the worlds of our deepest longings? And this year, we felt a break from this kind of, in some ways, very beautiful, very poetic, right? Like capturing of, oh, this more beautiful world is possible. There is something more beautiful that's possible. And this year we went for education for the end of the world as we know it. Because really, that's what it feels like. And at least from my specific vantage point, that is what it feels like. The end of the world as we know it. And the reason I say that is because that feels okay. It doesn't feel like it's deeply urgent and, oh my God, I have to fix it. Because actually, you know what? It's not that things are going to get bad. Things are bad. Things have been bad. People are dying. People have been dying. People have been being murdered. There's no, I think, sugarcoating that. And I think that for me, what needs to happen in these spaces, what feels really important in these spaces is that actually we need to learn, of course, to be gentle and kind with one another and loving and compassionate, and also how to be really real and really truthful and really honest, and not let our desire to be nice or good, which I think really comes up in activism, this desire to be good and good enough and perfect, actually overshadow the pain and the suffering. Because it is the end of the world as we know it, but it's not a zombie apocalypse. It's not, you know, the Hollywood films, right? It's an invitation actually to reorient ourselves, to position ourselves as human beings differently to one another and to the rest of this magical living world. And I think that the conversation around mental health needs to come into that. Mental health is not separate. It's not a silo. I would say it's not just mental either. Yeah. I think I will leave it there, or I will just blah, 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 for a long time.
Well, thank you. I mean, that was beautiful and very powerful, and only beginning to absorb so much of it. But thank you for your insight and, more importantly, your honesty. So maybe if we just take a second to breathe and then move on to Joe. But
thank you, Joan. it's a difficult act to follow, right? And I'm going to be the one who's like doing statistics and things. What I wanted to do as a foundation, we take an interest in mental health, and I wanted to kind of place a few bits of data into this space, and give you a few pieces of interpretation. So the first piece of sort of data that I wanted to throw out was a Eurobarometer. So this is all European countries, about 50,000 young people, and I asked them lots and lots of different questions. This is from 2022, and the answer to this, you don't need to read it now. This is just for you to capture if you want. I'll tell you the answer. This really rocked me, because so it asked these 50,000 people, what's the biggest thing that keeps you up at night? And I was expecting to see climate up here and then everything else. And I didn't. Joint first with climate was mental and physical health. And I'm assuming that there was a major focus on mental health there. I was like, wow, I was not expecting that. Massive pool of young people who are placing climate and mental health on an equal footing. That's very interesting. Now, it's self-reported. And so we need to obviously put that into perspective. But the second piece of it sort of got me thinking and digging and researching and sending my team to do interesting things. And then the second piece of data that I will sort of throw at you then is then a guy called Jonathan Haddett, who's just written a book called The Anxious Generation. And he's done the numbers, and they're pretty scary. What's really interesting, though, is that it's mainly a Western rich country problem that's especially present in secular individualistic nations. And so if you look at those sort of bundle of OECD countries, we see, if we take 2010 as our starting point, we see 140% increase in depression among boys and girls. We see 259% increases in admissions to hospital because of self-harm. So it's over triple the amount that one would see. And those are really powerful signals beyond the self-reportedness. I will drop the data in there. You guys can spend your time going through it. The root hypothesis of this, and hopefully I now connect into a bit of the wisdom from the ground, which Ila was discussing, is that the tight bonds of community insulate people against lots and lots of different harms, especially and including mental ones, and that those tight, strong bonds of community are fraying. That's the reason, perhaps, why we're seeing a lot of these things. And those loose bonds of modern, wealthy, individualistic, secular lifestyles make young people pretty vulnerable, especially to problems associated with phone-based childhood. Because what you do is you create these, as Ila said much nicely, these sometimes quite awkward kind of community spaces and relationships and things where you can have conflicting and different and strange emotions with very, very thin surface chat rooms where you can't have the meaningful conversations that you need to maybe have. So that's sort of a hypothesis that I wanted to sort of land here. But I didn't want to just sort of do doom and gloom. I wanted to also just suggest two spaces where there can be improvement. We know there should be difference. So one of the things, and I mentioned this last time, that we also support is something called the Youth Progress Index. It's a global index which looks at about 60 different indicators of how young people are doing across the world. And a bit driven by my shock from that 2022 survey of climate and mental change being joint top, we dove into mental health indicators. And they're all there, and you can look at them. But the one I just want to raise, which I think is maybe interesting, is there is a surprisingly strong correlation between housing and mental health. and the ability, or if young people thought that they would be able to buy their own house and own their own space. I think there's something really important there, and I'm really happy to deep dive into it. I don't have so much time right now, but I just want to leave that. And I think there's some interesting signals that others are seeing that too. For the first time, we have a European representative who's doing something on housing. If we look at national politics in the UK, they're committing to building hundreds of thousands of new houses, etc. It's a problem, and it's actually quite importantly connected to mental health, and that's sort of one of the economic problems which play into mental health. And then the second and final thing that I'll say, and I'll close here, is, and I've already alluded to it, is we have unleashed a digital, I don't even know what to call it nowadays, but something into the minds of young people, and it's absolutely wild for us to have done so. So there's a whole movement now of banning phones in schools, which I think is there's a lot of evidence to suggest that's a really good step. But I'd go even further to say banning social media access below 16 is a pretty good thing as well. I think Australia is just about to, or has just started on that journey, because there's the economic stuff, and then there's the cultural stuff, and those two combined are probably driving these really big numbers that we're seeing, and when we're looking at sort of proxies for mental health. So I'm going to stop there, and I mean, I'm keen to have the discussion, and I can dig into any of that, but I just wanted to sort of leave you with that sort of some data, two pieces of hope, and a hypothesis of maybe community is the thing which we need to focus on.
Well, thank you, Joe. That was both very, very helpful and sort of insightful in another, sort of angle onto this issue, and complements, I think, very well Ila's comments before. So I look forward to some deeper digging. Indra.
Thanks very much. And it's really something to be dropped into this conversation where two very different perspectives have arisen, and there's so many layers to respond to. So I'm going to try to, and Joan, you may have to raise your hand and tell me enough at some point, but I'm going to try to ride the wave. You know, it's like a tsunami has already been set. I'm going to try and surf that wave. My own experience, and probably why I'm sitting here, is because maybe to acknowledge what Joe was saying about the self-reporting of the West, the Northern Hemisphere, and the West in particular, and the framing of the question and the issues of mental health, you know, have been identified now as something that is specific. And I thank you, Joe, for highlighting that. But it's also been the entire public space that we've all grown up with. You know, we've all grown up in a public space that was defined by certain values, certain arrangements, certain power structures, shaped by singular gender. I mean, this is the public space we've been living in, all of us as adults, since I don't think there's anyone old enough here to say that you weren't brought up in that space. 30 years ago, there was something of a revolution, because the digital space, the one that maybe is being seen as a problem, actually gave people access to so much more information and relationship to each other, and interestingly, new forms of intimacy online that were never experienced before. Especially women experience for the first time in their lives the ability to be in the public space as themselves. Young women in particular really made the most of it. For a lot of people, this was a revolution that we've been in for 30 years. And when you are with it, with the revolution and with the opening up and with a sense of we are waking up to something, you become very, very aware of the cognitive dissonance of the world we've accepted. I'm just going to say that again, the cognitive dissonance of the world we've accepted, which includes the acceptance and the tolerance of nuclear bombs, the acceptance and the tolerance of the meat industry, the dairy industry, the acceptance and tolerance of inequality and hierarchy that is inhuman. We live in that cognitive dissonance, and we always have. And the problem is, for all of us parents, is that we normalized it for ourselves. And now we're living with a generation that's woken up to something. And because so many adults can't support the children in their waking up to something that is simply true, we've got whole governments calling out a generation of waking up people as wrong. You know, we have politics that it calls itself anti-woke, anti-waking up. And in this world, we posit the problem as the mental health of young people. So I just want to, in a way, this is, I know, reflecting some of what Ela said, but I've been somewhat educated by youth and by listening to young people and realizing the deep sanity of young people who can be in community with each other, hold each other, and brave this era of transformation. So I've studied conflict resolution, I've studied soft power, I've studied politics. I am a political entrepreneur. I'm also a psychosocial therapist and a Buddhist. And what psychosocial therapy teaches you, that there is no separation between the self and the environment, as Buddhism teaches as well. There is no mental health problem without a social health condition for that problem to arise. Of course, when we look at young people built up, who may be brought up in very dysfunctional families, maybe violence in the home, maybe a lot of separation, that is specific and people need help. But what we're looking at here are young people growing up in a very dysfunctional, breaking down world, which I'm going to label the end of modernity, not the end of the world, actually. It's the end of modernity, at the end of a certain settlement with the world, which gave us the growth economy, gave us extraction, which gave us patriarchy and colonialism. That is the thing we're seeing coming to an end. And there should be some celebration of that. There isn't, because governments are still holding on for all they're worth to that settlement. However, the internet, while at the same time being a dangerous place if you have no support, if you do have support, it's the richest place. And also, not all conversations held like this are superficial. During COVID, the most profound conversations took place in the Zoom room. It changed the lives of many people. For many people, it's the first time they were asked, how are you, in the course of a day? Because their jobs never afforded that question. So I'm just laying out this overall picture. And if I could just name 9 things that I think being in community can offer all of us, young people, which are the emotional needs we're all trying to get met. And this goes throughout history, whether we're in old times or new times. That what a human being needs, essentially for mental health, is to be able to answer the motivation towards 9 things: security, attention, autonomy, intimacy, the feeling of being part of a wider community, privacy, status, competence, and meaning and purpose. When we can get those emotional needs met for people in community, then they're capable of moving into the future together. The crime that we've been witnessing over all of our lives is that advertising has tried to answer all of those needs through selling us products. We believe we have these things because we have shoes and trainers and houses and possessions. That's how we got our status and our belonging. But now we have to reinvent that. And it's communities like Youth by Youth that are busy reinventing how to get our emotional needs met so that we're capable of the future. Okay, it's enough for me.
Well, thank you very much. Again, extraordinarily rich, and I think, and thank all the people who've been taking notes throughout these 3 conversations to help us absorb these ideas as we move forward and pursue them more deeply. So thank you, Indra. Shaun.
Wow. Well, good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever it is for you folks. And I'm really looking forward to getting to the group discussion phase, because there's so many powerful points that have been expressed, and I know there's so much in the room that can follow on from that. And before we do that, I'd just like to go back to the beginning and one of the first points that Ela made, actually, which were about mental health being a symptom, actually, is what I heard, Ela. It's a symptom of a deeper malaise within the systems that we're creating as we're going about our daily tasks. And we're inhabiting them, we're creating them. And in some ways, we're nested in the unforeseen consequences of that, because we can't see them in the way that we need to see them. And this comes to bear for me as an educator, and I just wanted to kind of share a story to start to kick us off, about a school that I used to run in Liverpool in England. Because we're confronted by this all the time, and particularly in this school, it was a school for 14 to 19-year-olds that gathered young people from the settings that they were already in, that they felt a bit uncomfortable in, and offered them kind of a different approach, a more creative and innovative approach to education. And the first challenge that I faced in setting that school up was the mismatch between the expectations of the system and the needs that Indra has outlined that are essential for our own growth, development, and thriving. And and from that experience, I think, or through that experience, actually, and the only way that I was able to do that was by kind of looking really, really carefully into the eyes of those young people and sort of saying, what is it that you need from this experience? And we had like 350 kids who were kind of shoring up and creating kind of a set of cultural values around which they could feel sort of seen, they could acknowledge and sort of honor one another's contribution. There was a sort of deep sense of acceptance within the culture that they were creating, and it spoke to me of the kind of conditions we need in all of the systems that we're part of, if we're going to kind of bridge that divide between symptom and kind of consequence that we seem to be embedded within. And then I got a chance actually to think about what that looks like from the perspective of systems and people who change systems. And it was interesting for me to talk to systems leaders who are making change at a system level. And I got a chance to ask them, many of them, we developed a framework that I referred to last time called the Togetherness Practice that you can look up online. And the essence of that work was what is it that we're able to, or how is it that we're able to resource ourselves and others in service of a more equitable and sustainable world? And so by kind of interviewing people who were doing that and living it, we were able to sort of surface a few insights really that came from them that I think kind of echo some of the points that have been made in terms of the shift we're trying to make individually and collectively. And the first point really was around their ability to slow down, to listen, to notice and become increasingly aware of themselves and others. And so having kind of empathy and conscious empathy and compassion really as a core value and skill set almost that underpinned their own growth and development, how they sought to relate to others. And the second thing they surfaced was giving themselves permission to identify what was unique about their own gifts. I remember one of them saying to us in a conversation, you know, that part of our responsibility in the world is to allow ourselves to be the best versions of ourselves that we're able to be, and to do the same for others, and to be able to give ourselves permission to do that, and to create those conditions for others. You know, that's really, I think for me, you know, that shows up in the challenge we have with that shows up in the world when we see all the deficit-based cultures that we're faced with, you know, across the systems of health and education, and business and everything else. You know, we're constantly asking ourselves, where did it go wrong? Whereas we'd be better served identifying the assets that help us explore how it all goes right and how things get better. But we're not able to do that if we're locked in cycles of sort of criticism, really, at this as a self and other sort of level. And that led to a third insight, really, which was around the ability to discern the conditions that are at play within ourselves and between ourselves and around us. And you know, some of you might have read Jeremy Lent's work around patterning, and patterning, I think, became a very significant emblem, really, of that interplay between who am I, what am I seeing in the world, how is what I'm seeing in the world informing who I am, how am I able to negotiate and assimilate change in a constructive way that allows me to be of purpose in the world. And you know, these supremely sort of talented, really, change makers were able to do that. They were able to work with kind of patterns, with holes, with complexity, with what was emerging for them. And they were able to kind of create spaces for others to do the same. And so it kind of requires well, what I was learning really is that it requires that sense of being able to think at different levels of perspective. And that's why empathy is so important for this, because it's about decentering ourselves and being able to discern the needs of others, but also the limitations of ourselves cognitively as we're trying to do that. While we are kind of the fifth point, if there's anyone more after this, but you know, they were really expert in grounding what they were doing in their own caring, in their own beliefs, in their own principles. And how do we act from a sense of purpose and enact that in the world was a question that we were left with. You know, what is the alignment that we feel that we can live through at the levels of self and organization and system? And in order to unlock all that, really, the other learning that I took from that was around psychological safety, trust, and belonging. You know, how do we act in service through partnership and collective means? Indra mentioned kind of intimacy, or somebody mentioned intimacy, and when I see that word, I always see like into me, you see. You know, as we're considering that kind of conditions, what are those conditions of trust and vulnerability that we're able to create in spaces that nurture our joint sense of seeing ourselves, seeing one another? And I'll just underline this by kind of, I think my most important learning from that is that in order to shift from the systems that we're embedded into the systems that we need, we've got to first be able to see those systems. And now it's incumbent on us to recognize, I think, that we're not necessarily equipped to do that in the way that we need to yet. And, you know, the learning that we need to do is hidden in the problems that we need to solve. And actually, I think it's only by creating those conditions through which we can solve those problems together that we're able to do the learning we need to do the creation that will serve us individually, us in relationship, and hopefully better systems will flow from that. So, you know, we apply this with school leaders through the work that we do at the university, and you know, I'll just end with it on a moment on a note of hope, because I am incredibly moved actually all the time with how school leaders see this. They get it, and they're as encumbered by the systems that they're within as kind of as we are. It's just that maybe being outside those systems and looking in, it's easier to give ourselves the latitude that we do to talk about it in the way that we become accustomed. One of them said last week, actually, I realize now, Shaun, she said that the cavalry isn't coming to save us, which I thought was a lovely way of kind of, it's a lovely call to action for the group actually to start creating the conditions that they need together to do some collective action to create a better outcomes for the young people they're working with. So thank you, folks, and I'm really looking forward to opening up the discussion.
No, thank you, Shaun. I mean, again, just a richness that has touched upon things that each of your colleagues have said in the opening comments. And I think we're all trying a little bit to connect these or find, a place for us to take it further. But maybe the first step in that is for the four of you. If you have questions for one another, something you want to clarify, pursue, let's start with, Indra, Joe, Shaun, and Eva, just having a little conversation among yourselves, if you would like to. Are there things that you would like to pursue more deeply?
Shaun, I'd like to ask you a question.
Please do.
How much do you come across? I was a school governor for a while, and so what I've found a lot was there was quite a clash between the wider public expectations of what success means for a young person and what might arise for them in a conversation with me or with you as being two quite different things. And it's never enough to say, oh, just ditch one and choose the other. There has to be a sort of a ability to ride that apparent conflict, one almost entirely to do with becoming secure through having a good job, having enough money, and the other one about becoming a stronger, more sensitive, more capable person with more capacities. And what even counts as a capacity for a young person, or for any person. I mean, every time I use the word young person, I know I could be talking to my own peers and we'd have the same questions, actually, because we're all children in that sense, in this age where we're trying to generate something new. And we have childish emotions, actually, about it, which is, sometimes the parents are much more childish than the children. But the holding on, the idea that in order to become safe, you should ditch the internet, or you should ditch the tools of the internet. To me, I'm almost the most difficult to really answer. But the background of it is, to be successful and strong, you must have money and land and houses and, the body and so on. Very difficult to disabuse a young person of that notion and to truly value something else.
Yeah. There's so much in that, Indra, and there's a few, really the underlying kind of shift that I see in the question, is a shift from an either or kind of perspective to a yes and a perspective. And increasingly as I'm looking at this, I'm seeing that is not only possible but absolutely necessary. 20 years ago, I remember being in Mumbai and speaking with a kind of amazing social innovator there, and she said to me, Shaun, you've got to understand that every parent in India wants the children of India to be the next Mahatma Gandhi, so long as it's not their child. And there's a real, there is a real tension. And then now you sort of fast forward 20 years and you throw technology, particularly AI, in the frame, and you look at the skills and the capacities and capabilities that we need to privilege in order to function well in that world. And actually, it's emotional acuity and sensitivity and intelligence. It's being able to look after one another. It's being able to read ourselves and one another and patterns of the system, and be able to function really well strategically in order to ask the difficult questions that are going to add value to what the technology can do. And sort of with a creative, ring around all that, really. And so, I think that we're early in that conversation, but I think that's a kind of general, that there's a recognition starting to appear, I think, that social and emotional skills, creative skills are part of the answer to how we deal with technology. And embedded within that is an authenticity about our ways of living, that enable us to be more aligned and connected to nature and one another. You can't, it's almost that the first paradigm that you outlined, Indra, almost comes from a world of left brain siloed, mechanistic, and separate thinking of separateness. I sense that we're moving towards much more interconnection, and that means much more holistic thinking, and that's means much more integration at every level. And that's the kind of really thrust of what hopefully will be valued and put into focus in the future.
Thank you.
I've got an interesting question, that comes to me every time we do this sort of work with head teachers. They're saying we put them in a circle often, we do some breathing and pausing, and we ask them to reflect on it. And they say, my gosh, that's so impactful. Even primary school teachers, who one would think do circle time all the time, but maybe when they get into senior positions, they don't. But the question that always comes back to us, and that we discuss together, is why don't we give ourselves permission to pause as a starting point to all this work and creating these conditions? And what would be possible if we actually did that? And that's, I don't know whether any of the panelists want to reflect on that, because I think it's fundamental, really.
I mean, interesting. There's so I want to ask Ila something straight from that, because there's quite a trend. There's been quite a period of time, when meetings were started with a little meditation. But what I noticed is there's no real invitation to observe outwardly. What are you seeing? Even in the people in the room that you're sitting in. So if you don't mind, I'd like to use your question and ask Ila something around, what do you think the role of the imagination is in your movement amongst young people? Where can your imagination go? And do you encourage imagination? Because, it could be that one encourages coping, and managing and securing and so on, but where does your imagination take you?
Oh, I think everywhere is my one word short answer. But imagination is a third of our pedagogy. So we start our kind of sense making and meaning making of the world with what is, and then move into what if, which is the term that we use is radical reimagination. And then move into what now, this phase of collective action. And I think that particularly the sort of stance that Youth by Youth takes in terms of imagination is that actually imagination is not enough. We must reimagine. It's this recognition that actually imagination is what has built this world, right? Modernity, as you described it, capitalist modernity, the many names for the place that we're in right now. And imagination is what built this. Imagination is what builds and creates and nurtures everything, whether or not we're conscious of it. And I do think, like you said, Shaun, that is really the power of having that moment to just remember that actually there is within this body a multitude of different beings and things and systems collaborating with one another. And one of those things that when you tune in with the breath or the body or the other people in the room is our imagination, our capacity to wonder about one another and ourselves and the moment. And what I see and what we see with young people and what we have talked about and recognized is that our current education systems quite actively, it feels like, stifle this capacity to imagine. And in some ways, sometimes it feels like feel quite proud of it. They're almost proud that, you know, we're not thinking about outlandish things anymore. We're not, you know, dreaming that we're going to have or be something that is beyond the boundaries of what is socially acceptable and okay, that actually we've restricted ourselves to, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up has become a job, right? Like, why? It's such a small, simple thing, but, you know, that question is automatically answered with a career. And I think that tells you so much about how we educate and indoctrinate our children. So there's something really powerful about imagination. And there's also something very complex about imagination because it's hard to imagine outside of the world in which we have been raised. And I think that what you said before about, you know, this, you put it really beautifully, and I can't remember how you phrased it now, Indra, but what you phrased about like almost the landscape that we've grown up in, the mindset that we've all grown up in. And then Shaun mentioned this with, you know, the problems, some of the learnings that we need to learn are within the problems. I would also say that a lot of the solutions that we're coming up with, a lot of the ways out of the problems that we're coming up with are created from that very same mindset. And that's why it doesn't feel like we're getting anywhere, because we're attempting to solve a problem with the same thinking that created it. And I think I see this in imagining too. And I'm very curious about this because now as Youth by Youth, we've been alive for about 5 years. And so actually, I'm starting to realize that a lot of our imaginings are still very much within this system. And it's very easy and it's very fun to have all the language and to create our own way of speaking to one another and our own way of decoding the system. And yet we're still in it as much as we like to think that we're not. We're still kind of mired in the mud. And I think there's something really important about then coming from that place, not a place of I'm outside of the system, not a place of I have an objective view on it, but of I'm deeply entangled and enmeshed with something that I don't agree with, that I don't believe in. And yet on some level I must believe in it because I uphold it with my being, whether or not I want to. And then where do I go from there? How do I imagine a new reality? How do I imagine a new way of being? How do we reimagine growing up from within this very complex, entangled place?
Oh, well, thank you. I'd like to sort of circle back now, and I don't, okay, I'd like to just to two of the comments. One is, Veer, would you like to say more about your comment, which I just lost again? And then Henny, if you're with us, maybe we can talk about your comment. But Veer, let's begin with you, if that's okay.
Yes, of course. I'm from Argentina, so I'm speaking from the southwest place in the world. So maybe my way of seeing the world is tremendously different from you. I work with communities, and what I feel is that we need to practice community with from where we are, and to really reflect on that practice to create a new meaning for that word. I feel that that word is not the same. When I talk to my grandmother, we are talking about different things when we talk about community, and we look for different needs in a community. So I think we need to practice more and to be responsible for the communities we are part of, because communities really are there. It doesn't matter if we are, I mean, if we are an active part or not, but with our neighbors, we are a community. With our colleagues, we are a community. So I feel we have a lot of places where we can practice community because we are already practicing it, but maybe we are not reflecting on how we show up to our communities and what a community means for us now. Because it's a really big shift, right? For me, for example, a community is a place where we have elders taking care of us as the young people. And that's something that's missing for me now. I see older people taking care of themselves and trying to understand how to help, but without asking young people what we need. Just trying to understand, talking between each other, which is really weird for me. So I'm keeping this question, how to be an elder and how to ask for what we need as young people too. And how to practice community and reflect on that together. That's what I feel. Thank you.
Yeah, that was beautiful. Would someone like to respond to that? I don't want to cut off conversation. And if so, just speak. Well, I want to thank you for that. And my bet is that we will end up coming back to that issue of the differences. I mean, I personally want to know, but we don't need to do that now, the difference between your sense of community definition and your grandmother's. And just in clarifying that there are many other pieces of that warrant further thought and investigation. So thank you. Henny, are you here? I know your name is here. There's a comment here, a long comment.
Yes, I'm here, but
Okay.
you know, I'm a bit like a fish out of water in this discussion. I'm here to learn, and I've just shared some parallel from what I experience and what I hear in the discussions. A lot of, I mean, the world in which we live is basically a fractal environment. So it's fractal behavior that you encounter with. The way we structure our living space and the governance structures we put on it does not really match that. In the past, it seemed not to have matter because I don't know. I see the past as a world where there was value attached to central control, to all the things that derive from that, and that is basically going to change, I believe. So I think there's a lot of significance in understand better what this fractal nature implies for for human structures, human ecosystems. Because one of the interesting things about a fractal is that a very basic event has different impacts at different levels of recursion in that fractal structure, in that ecosystem. Once one understands that, you will realize that you must pay attention to the detail of small things, because there's always cause-effect relationships between all these different layers, and nothing is really insignificant. So the world haven't changed really. It has always been a fractal, and human ecosystems have always been, but it's the way we respond that is changing. It's the way I hear people talk about an awakening, and I think that's very accurate. There is an awakening happening. And that awakening has so many dimensions. Most of them I hear so eloquently described from the soft sciences side. But if you look at these things from a more logical perspective, well, you are always also logical, so that's a wrong word. But from the world that I live in, these things can be quantified. These things can be pinpointed. They can be defined as part of a structure that is part of a man-made construct, and you can change that. So look, I don't think I've got much to contribute. I'm just trying to explain my comment that I've made.
No, thank you very much. Would anyone, let me just ask, if you can turn on your cameras, please do, since we're really just in discussion now. And
Sorry. No.
it won't work for everyone, but just to the extent we can, that makes the conversation, I think, both more personal and easier. And we're moving at a pace where we can just jump in and not wait to be called upon. Having said that, I'd like to ask Louis if he would like to elaborate on his comments about agency.
Yes, thank you so very much. Yeah, I'm sitting here with two resonances, enjoying our conversation so profoundly. To really start from the relational aspects of the public crisis and our relation to the living world, our relation to the social other, and our relation to ourselves as in mental states, as something to move on, and to acknowledge that it needs those spaces of pause, these spaces of co-reflection, of lived experience to make sense of the world, of what is and what could be. And what I'm sitting now with is very much invited by various contribution to think of communities in itself and communities for itself. And that there has been a time when it was so easy to say, oh, the community is what surrounds me. And if we reflect ourselves as a community, we move from just a group of people to a community for itself, a community that is aware of itself, that is conscious of itself. And what I'm sitting now with is a question, to what extent are we moving into a space where new communities for itself emerge? And as looking at us here, to what extent are we just a group in a Zoom call? Or to what extent are we living into an awareness of being a community in itself and for itself, and opening massive possibilities for us to co-reflect, to imagine, to grow into that future that we also desire? And to what extent is that facilitated by a global internet, which may even facilitate for a global civil society to become aware of itself. It's a global civil society for itself. And what kind of all human society would that be? So I'm sitting with a lot of questions, and I'm just enjoying the flow of the conversation, and I just leave it here without touching too much upon agency or the lots, but to just enjoy the moment. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Can I just offer something into this space, which is I'm sitting with Ila's question of how do we reimagine and this ensuing conversation around community and the fractal proposition. And I'm thinking the thing that was always there, but was never acknowledged in the public space, was that community was always there. Families were always there, communities were always there. But they were the job, if you like, the work of women nearly entirely. They reflected the private space. Communities where humans could be themselves, where members of a family could be themselves in a family. They're always loosely constructed, but were always there underneath the public space, which is the one we were taught was real. So real was the public space that you had to find a job in, that you had to find status in, that you had to find your power and agency within. And the thing you come home to is the private space where you just be yourself. You can be yourself, you could be amongst friends, you could be amongst the people you live in. These two things were always co-present, however, in a strict hierarchy, the one above the other. And I think the radical offer of the internet has been to meld the public and the private space. So much so that the internet sometimes looks entirely like a private space, everybody expressing their feelings and emotions and thoughts and wishes and dreams. But it's really just a balancing up of the formality of the public space that always held dominance. So sometimes the only way that I access my own reimagining is to actually come back to myself and realize, especially as a woman, but I know it's not just as a woman, because men have had their own dreams of escape from the world they created as well. But that dreaming and hoping and wishing of that, and the knowledge that it could be very different, has always been there. And that to me is the starting point of reimagining, is to reclaim yourself and value yourself and value the thing that has always been there in the private space, and then to have an ambition to reclaim the public space. I think the internet is merely rehearsing, but has to be self-organized in real time in a community somewhere. And this is where I'd come back to what Henny was saying, is that all of what is possible and is being played with infinitely, there's so many community agency networks of different kinds who are trying to reclaim a new relationship with the planet, for example, you know, through better health, through better energy systems, there are so many in this play space of trying to reclaim a better relationship with the planet for the people and the future. And they're fractal. To my mind, these are fractal. This is what what it offers quantum shift is possible through these fractal experiments. And we'll see it on the internet, but you can't do it without the real-time reconvening of people claiming truth about themselves on the ground where they live. And the hard work is in building those relationships amongst people, because we can barely speak to each other or tolerate each other. That's where all the hard work is gonna be.
Well, Indra, that might be a nice segue into, and thank you for that, into Halima. I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. Are you with us now? You made a comment about meditation and imagination. We'll give a minute to see if she's here or just her name is here.
Okay, so I'm here and
Lovely, thank you.
so good. Unfortunately, I don't know if I have permission to have my video on, and I'm calling from Kenya, and I've been following this conversation. Thanks, Tamsin, for the invitation. And the most critical thing as far as meditation, of which Ila commented on, was the power of meditation and the power of imagination to that transcend healing. And I believe one thing about imagination is what you think is what you become, and how that connects to mental health amongst the young generation. And I was connecting with it with, I come from the society that defines what humanity, what success, what prosperity looks like, and how that puts pressure to the young generation. And we were cracking a joke with a team of the community that I work with, is that when somebody dies at 30, God forbid, they will tell you that you've died young. But by 30, when you are yet to succeed as to how the society expects of you, you are considered a failure. As that if you are a young woman and at 30 and you yet to get married, you're yet to get a job, you're considered a failure in a society. And that defines the level of pressure a young person who is probably clocking 30 and they're yet to achieve things in life the way the society demands them to have achieved, and what puts to their mental health and their mental well-being. And that leaves us with the opportunity to imagine how life would look like when we choose to create it in our own mind, in our own imagination, but also just redefining what success means to an individual in their own diversity, in their own unique way, in their own imagination, so that I'm not pressured to live by how people want me to live. I'm not pressured. Of course, it brings about creativity, innovation, but also it leaves with the option of living to what you can achieve, so that now you are not so pressured to go outside your mental health. And we are losing people, we are losing humanity just because of the pressure. And the last thing I think I had posted a question on living in a community in the midst of pressure of achieving goals, succeeding amidst limited resources. And I'm like, at what level do we make communities? I don't want to call them safe, because I don't think if we have ever had a safe community, but how do we make community livable, community hospitable enough to accommodate humanity and put value to humanity more than any other thing? That is what I'm trying to imagine right now. Thank you.
No, thank you very much. Okay, Jeff Holland, would you like to say a few things about what you, okay, I'm sorry, okay. Jeff Holland and then Jerry.
Yes. Thank you. I just want to say, I think Jane Goodall put it right. I mean, she said, if you want to get to the heart, you have to do it with stories. And as Joan knows, I've dedicated my life to trying to find a way to tell stories that make a difference. And I just think that we've got to get past the sense of entitlement that exists, has existed with humans since we first got here 200,000 years ago when we became a species. We've always had a sense that everything else on the earth was here for us to take as we wish. To meet our needs. At first, it was about survival, but now it's about entitlement. And it's never been worse than it is right now. we're killing 250 million animals a day to feed people in the western part of the world. That's a disgrace. There's no need for that because we have systems now that allow us to manufacture protein and animal tissue from cell cultures. And this could happen, this could be done right now. We already have these systems in place. The problem is people like Elon Musk, who are only interested in themselves, who will use their money to pervert the politics that we have and prevent us from getting to a place where we do the right thing. And I think that's part of why women are, right now in the United States, there's this regressive thing about bringing women back to where they once were, where they were stuck in the home as caregivers. I just feel like women's voices must be heard to a much greater extent than they ever have before. And I'm really disappointed in what happened in our last election, because I think that the candidate that was female in that election was incredibly gifted and far superior to what we got. So we've got to find a way to get past that. And I think part of that is learning how to use the internet to tell stories and get people's attention past this huge drone of information that really leads to nothing. That's what I have to say.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeff, for that. And Jerry, wherever you are, I can't find you at the moment, but
I'm not entirely sure I can follow that. Jeffrey, I'm totally with you on your assessment of what's happened in the States, but I was wondering at earlier parts of the conversation, and probably the moment has passed, when Indra was asking about imagination. I'm not entirely sure the word imagination is the right one. I think escape might be. Frankly, all of us have in our arsenal serious capacity for escape, and it's a really important part of the toolkit. And I certainly think that we need to understand better how we can trigger escapism, because I think we all need it sometimes to get out of the context that we're in. But I wondered, the reason I was saying this is I wondered whether, because we're speaking English in this conversation, we're not coming at this with a very Anglo-Saxon or Northern Western perspective and sort of laying down the law about what society was or was not like. And I'm not sure, in fact, that you can be as clear that everywhere it mattered what, the career. I don't know. When I first came to the UK, I was a 14-year-old kid, and I would hear people talk about, what does your husband do, as a start to a conversation. It was a way of placing a person in a social stratosphere. And in Italy, they wouldn't ask what your husband does. They'd ask somebody, how does your husband vote? Okay, there was a really different way of coming at people. And I'm wondering if sometimes we are blindsided by the languages that we're speaking, and then the kind of cultural framework that we bring with us to the table. Having said all of that, I'm curious about this whole issue of calling it mental health or well-being. I heard you, Ila, in saying this is about deep, and I think you used the word, Indra, deep sanity rather than mental health. And it's a question of this cognitive dissonance that there is between the world we live in, the kind of meat you were talking about, Jeffrey, and the production of meat, and what we know about what it's doing to the planet, that I think makes us, I don't know how to deal with the cognitive dissonance that we all carry with us, and we carry it with us in every single shape or form. And I don't know how useful that is. It may have passed its moment. Thank you.
No, well, thank you. And I think we'll come back to that. As we wrap up, are there final comments? Graham, I haven't had a chance to read your comment, but would you like to say something about that?
Well, yes, very briefly. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes,
Can you see me?
I can see you.
Oh, great. This is a major moment for me because don't let me put you off. I've been a mathematician all my life, trying to solve mathematical and statistical problems. And in my dotage, I thought perhaps I can use my training to dig down the nub of all the crises in the meta crisis. And so I've been thinking for a number of years now and reading and attending these just recently. And at the moment, I'm also doing a 7-week Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet from Plum Village and Thich Nhat Hanh. And I sense a lot of Buddhist ideas coming through in this session as well. I know you probably sound soppy, but when I boil all these crises down, it's all about relationship, not just between humans, but between humans and animals, and between humans and trees, and between relationships of all sorts. And I've been very inspired by Martin Buber's book of 102 years ago that I mentioned in the chat, just on I and Thou. It's a tough book to read, but 100 years ago, he was saying relationship is everything. And I noted in the last meeting with delight that Stephen Heinz, had in his chat said, maybe it comes down to sharing and caring. And Lewis, I think you were there and you put in a lovely little thing saying, maybe it all comes down to love. So, of course, people would say it's naive, but it's extremely hard. It's extremely tough. And I'm fascinated by this Zen course at the moment and the reach that the Buddhists have for no self. And that's a stage beyond I and thou in relationship, and possibly more than we need. But the challenge to us all now is how to bring this about, of course, from the individual through to the giant institutions of this world. I've been writing about it myself simply because I don't want to die before I feel I've got some sort of an answer to all this in my own head. And I've got this, being a mathematician, I've got this relationships. Our scientific and our tech advancement have way outpaced our relationship development. And Buber tells us that it's nothing, it's much simpler than fractalizing everything. It's just an interval from 0 to 1, from an I-it relationship, which is one of hierarchy, to I-thou, which is one of interbeing, as the Buddhists would say. And we have to somehow push where we are at the moment in this grand measure of relationship quality, if you can picture it, of all types of relationship in this world, from where we are at the moment, which I put about 0.1 on a 0 to 1 scale, much, much higher if we're to get through this problem. So we can push it through education, and we can pull it through Buddhist type no self thinking. Okay, to me, we have to have a massive education campaign. It's possible. And I volunteer for the Red Cross here in the UK, and we talk about first aid, and there's this thing called the bystander effect. And the bystander effect doesn't just occur when someone collapses in front of you in Liverpool Street Station. It's us now as we look at the problems in front of us. We're all bystanding to say, it's too big, leave it to somebody else, apart from small groups like this. So I think education, as a mathematician, I think, well, maybe 20% of us are sympathetic towards this and understand it and agree. 20% never will. But if each of us, the R factor of COVID, can hit 3 people and convince them, we'll have 80% sympathetic, and we'll immediately start to change the entire structure of society. And the ideas are there. Just reading Tim Jackson from the University of Surrey is it on a new economic system. Oh, there's many, many ideas out there. We just need leaders who can see it. And being a New Zealander and proud of Jacinda Ardern, they do come there, but they get shot down with the horror of social media and we lose them. So I'm an optimist. You have to remain an optimist. And I think we know what to do, but we just have to get around to doing it. And so we need to push and pull that relationship quality in its grandest sense upward, and we'll make it. Okay, thanks for listening to me.
Well,
It's
thank
just
you
my
very much.
diatribe.
Not at all. And since we're at the top of the hour, I'd like to just leave a little time for open conversation. But first, I want to thank Tom for taking such fabulous notes in the chat and capturing key ideas. To thank Joe and Indra and Eva and Shaun for launching this conversation, triggering so many ideas. I don't think our goal should be to have a conclusion, but rather the richness to carry forth in our own lives and communities. But one takeaway I have is that maybe what we call ill health, and going back to Ila's classifying this as sickness, is actually good mental health. And so that making that shift to thinking that the concerns, the issues, the recognition of our world and our place in it and living with it is actually a sign of good health. And so what do we do with that to move forward rather than the fix it, the intervention, the change? Just that's one idea that will sit with me for a while. Are there any just closing comments among any of you? And, just speak up.
My closing comment, Joan, I'd just like to kind of reflect on what Graham was just saying about the primacy of relationships, because it seems to have been a thread all the way through here. And, there's something, there's almost a call to action in there for me, because I see, just relating that to what you were saying, Indra, and how the public and private spaces are collapsing. The danger is that our ability to relate to people who aren't like us is getting further away, and maybe the challenge for us to do the work we need to do, and to answer Graham's call in terms of influencing others and just having that open conversation, is to connect with people who aren't quite so like us. And I think that's a real challenge, because we have to be intentional and sort of constructive in the way that we do that. It's not going to happen naturally in the way that we're being led. So that's my takeaway. But thanks for facilitating this so well.
And for some of us, we don't run into many people who aren't much like us.
And that's why we need to be really intentional about it. I know, absolutely. It's a challenge.
Beyond consciousness. Thank you. Other comments?
What I would add is it connects with relationships, but it's the me who shows up in a relationship that makes all the difference. And what we really haven't talked about today, and perhaps that's a future conversation, is the role of inner development. And that relates to children and youth, but I think it also relates to us as adults. I've done community development work and social development work for many more years than I'd like to admit. And one of the things that I was working with was as getting change makers in a room and and getting them to kind of map the kinds of initiatives that they were taking. And we used Ken Wilber's integral 4-quadrant map, if people are familiar with that. But what it showed was over and over again, what was left out in terms of capacity building was the psychosocial quadrant. And so I've made it my own work to help to start filling that in. But I'd like to see that more on the table, that we need to be paying attention with children. We can be supporting children to grow these capacities, so that as they get older, they can step into those leadership roles more effectively. So I'd just like to put that into the mix here and hope that other people might be also as interested as I am in that.
No, thank you very much. A very sort of rich and nice note to close on. Thank you all.
Yeah.
Thank you.